Hello everyone, Dr. Shabazz here. This is going to be the first of several videos that I will produce for the semester's class. On last Thursday, we went through the syllabus and we have some new students who have registered for the class. So what you want to do is you want to download the syllabus. There is a link on Canvas that is labeled syllabus, and when you click on that, it'll take you to a message that I have. When you click on the link to the syllabus, that will always give you an updated copy. It is easier that way because I don't have to cut and paste the whole syllabus in that space that they've provided for us. So I think it's easier to do it that way. It is a PDF file, and I will keep it updated so that you can always have the latest information. I just want to say a couple of things before we get started. We have a particular mandate, I believe it is, for testing those of you who have registered for the in-person class. We will be meeting in a couple of weeks or about 10 days, and we have to abide by the guidelines that are set forth by the university. You want to make sure you check the FAMU website for latest updates as far as COVID testing, which I believe for the students started this week, started yesterday, and for faculty members it starts next week. And so all of us can have peace of mind and ensure that we are in a safe environment. There is a town hall meeting on Thursday. There are questions that are being entertained, and they will take those questions, and most likely there will be questions concerning sanitation and different methods that they plan to use to keep the campus safe of the coronavirus. I was watching a virtual town hall. Well, it wasn't a town hall. It was more of a discussion on education and racism. And one of the speakers, I actually knew of him before this event, Jeffrey Canada, made a very interesting reference to a statement Frederick Douglass made. You all know who Frederick Douglass was, the abolitionist who in the 1800s spoke out very eloquently about the ills of slavery, and he fought for emancipation. But Jeffrey Canada made a quote, and he says that it is easier to build strong children than to fix broken men. This was something Frederick Douglass is credited with quoting, and most certainly here at FAMUSBI, we're in the business of building strong men and women, and that is what we will do this semester. And I hope that you have it within you to develop the kind of foresight and discipline to make that happen. I do want to say a few things. I regularly send messages to Canvas, so you want to make sure that you are checking. I don't know how you all get your messages, whether they are sent to your via email or text message or how they're received, but just make sure by all means that you check them. This was my last message, which I had an assignment, and it wasn't much of an assignment. I just wanted to get an idea of some of the places that you all are aspiring to travel to. And the reason I do that is just to kind of get an idea and overall idea of what your aspirations are. And to a degree, I may be able to help you make that happen. We have study abroad programs, and we have a lot of resources on campus. But the other thing is, when you do an assignment like that, you're almost telegraphing what it is you want to do because you've written it down and you've committed it to your mind. And you may, because of that assignment, you may continue to have that thought that, okay, this is a place that I want to visit, and this is how I'm going to make it happen. I did not get all of the assignments that were to be submitted, but we will deal with that at a later time. It was the first assignment, and it most likely will be one of those extra credit assignments that will be added on to help your status up toward the end. I typically, those types of assignments, I don't grade very hard, but it is important that you establish a discipline to do all the assignments that are given in this class so you can maximize your potential to get the grade that you're looking for. So I have uploaded the first couple of chapters of the book, and I make a note in here, you don't want to use the slides as your textbook because for obvious reasons, slides are for lectures. And you will see me presenting the slides today, and they're basically bullet points. I'm not going to be reading to you the slides because it takes too long, and that's not the purpose for slides. Slides are for basically jogging your memory, and so you can speak about these points in greater detail. And so you want to make sure that you get the text. Gaspar and others, you will see that. I believe it's only the second edition, so that book should be readily available. I have uploaded a case. Well, it's not really a case, it's an article, but it is a article on PepsiCo going into China with a product that we all know. Some of you love this product. I know when I was a kid, I used to love eating Cheetos. I mean, it was just, you were basically in another place when you had Cheetos, when you had your snacks. You were happy. I mean, these were happy times. And PepsiCo decided that they wanted to test the market, test the international market with their products, and they decided that China was that market. And so when you go to the this post and you click on this link, it will take you to an article that is titled China to Get a Taste of Cheeseless Cheetos. And you may notice that this article is from 1994, September 2nd, 1994, New York Times, and I read it many years ago, and I was fascinated by how much information was in this short article. It's a very short piece. And what is interesting and what I like to do in some of my materials that I share is I like to show you the entire picture. So here we see the entire picture of PepsiCo taking Cheetos into China. It shows the research that they had to do. It shows the relationships they had to build. It showed the R&D, the testing, the flavors. It showed the analysis of the market. It shows the adaptation of the product. It shows the packaging. All of these things came out in this very short article. And so I don't want you to be so focused on the fact that it's an old article, and I won't give you materials that are dated to the extent that it's not useful. So what I'm trying to convey here is the entire picture of presenting Cheetos to the Chinese market and how that evolved over time. And by the way, it is still a very successful product in China. So that is certainly a lesson that we can learn from. Okay, so let's start talking about chapter 1. This presentation, this is our first presentation, and it's going to be between 45 to 60 minutes. It's probably on the lower side, but we're going to get started. The first chapter is very basic. It talks about globalization. That is the main theme for a lot of courses like global business. Will have globalization in the first chapter because globalization means a lot of different things. It represents a stage of development for a company. It represents an action that I am engaging in globalization. And it is actually a concept. It is an entire concept, and people have written books about globalization. And so we're going to get started on this discussion of globalization. And if you have any questions, we'll pick this up on Thursday, and you can raise any questions or comments that you want to bring to the floor. And we might even have a chance to listen to some of the places that you'd like to go on Thursday. So first of all, we want to talk about globalization. And in the book, and again, this is the book we're going to be using, the second edition. And on page 5, it says, what is globalization? And it says here, globalization encompasses the socioeconomic reform process of eliminating trade, investment, information technology, and cultural and political barriers across countries, which could lead to increased economic growth and geopolitical integration and interdependence among nations of the world. So that is a mouthful, and it has been a controversial topic actually, because a lot of pundits will talk about globalization in a very positive sense, and that you're able to bring a lot of benefits because each nation focuses on what they do best. And if every country focuses and uses their resources to their maximum potential, they can specialize in that function. And then they can share that resource with everyone else. And if everyone does that, then the theory goes that it is better for everyone to be able to benefit from the specialties of other nations. So that's essentially what globalization is. And it says here on the slide, it can lead to increased growth, economic growth, and geopolitical integration and interdependence among nations of the world, meaning that you have a global supply chain. If someone is good at producing the best cotton because they have the climate and they have the infrastructure, then you import the best cotton that you can, and you make wonderful shirts, you make wonderful blouses, sweaters, or whatever the case may be. If someone has an abundant amount of copper, you import that high quality copper, and you make all types of electronic components because of the conductivity of copper. If someone has a specialty in cocoa and you want to make chocolate, then you import cocoa from those nations who specialize in making cocoa. So again, it creates an interdependence because those inputs become outputs of other nations. And so what the argument was for those who were against globalization, they would say, oh, well, globalization, that's just another word for Americanization or Westernization. Well, things have radically changed in the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years, even though Western nations still dominate the economic global landscape. They still dominate. But you have rising powers. You have the rise of China. You have South Korea, who has these very large companies, including Samsung, that are competing with the best of what Europe and America has to offer. In fact, one may argue that China, which is the world's leading manufacturer, has actually pulled even or maybe surpassed the United States in terms of their prowess, their economic strength. And you have a lot of Chinese investors buying American companies. It is interesting that sometimes you will find out about a company that we believe to be American, but then to find out that it's owned by a foreign entity. And there are a lot of companies like that, including companies like Budweiser, Ben and Jerry's, Holiday Inn, Firestone. These are all foreign owned. And even a company like General Electric, foreign owned. And you might say, well, how does that happen? Well, sometimes these companies struggle in the global market, and you have a global investor that wants to expand that product and take it into other markets, where that company, when it was American, did not have the resources, maybe didn't have the energy to move it in that direction. So now we have a more competitive playing field, and it's not just the Europeans and the Americans in a dominant position. You also have other countries that are called the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Also, South Africa is included. You have other nations in Southeast Asia: Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, very emerging economies. You have the MIT countries: Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, which are also competing for their place at the table in terms of this global economy. So these are the nations that I just mentioned, implementing more open trade and free market policies to compete with everyone from everywhere for everything. And of course, because you have technological diffusion, this is becoming more prevalent. As Western technology and Western innovation spreads around the world, then you have other companies that also begin to develop similar technologies and not only compete with the United States, but then also surpass them. So we have a very different world than we had 30, 40, 50 years ago. And this also means that as a budding business executive or entrepreneur, you have to make sure that you have the requisite skills to operate in a global environment, and that you're comfortable in these environments, and that you may decide to take on other skills that will make you more effective in the global environment, which may include learning a foreign language. It may include some training in terms of cross-cultural management. It may include more emphasis on studying foreign markets, currency dynamics. All of these things are going to be very important going forward. And as you see, you have a lot of competition, at the top. You look at this chart here, strategic competitors. You see the United States still on the top in terms of purchasing power parity, gross national income, and China, India, Japan, and then you have the rest. Many of these are industrialized nations. So it's getting rather crowded at the top, and so we have to make sure that we are prepared for the world that is upon us. So we're moving to a multipolar world. And multipolar, multi meaning many, and polar is essentially saying that you have many different points of the world that are competing or vying for this, I won't say control, but are competing for economic markets around the world. And you have the United States, you have the European Union, and you have Asian countries that represent these blocks. So decoupling is defined as a global shift in which industrialized, country-dependent developing economies grow based on their own underlying economic strengths rather than those of highly developed nations or countries. And we can see that in 1950, South Korea was just coming out of a war. 1950, 1953, the Korean War occurred, and thereafter Korea had to essentially rebuild. And now we look almost 100 years later, we look and that within 70 years, they have become a global power. And they have essentially become a lot more than just a place for cheap labor, or in terms of the textile industry, which is what they were known for back in the 80s. Very abundant sources of cheap labor, along with the other Asian nations of Hong Kong, Taiwan. These countries are now moving to industrialization. And then you see the layout of many of these competing countries. So some of the key institutions that we want to know about are the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, which the formal name of the World Bank is the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, but it's just known as the World Bank. Both the IMF and the World Bank were founded at the same conference, the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, right before the end of the war. And the purpose of these two organizations was to create stability in the global economy that was destroyed by the war. And the IMF provides emergency funding for countries who are in dire straits. The World Bank primarily provides developmental loans for long-term projects, building a bridge, a power plant, infrastructure. These are the types of projects that the World Bank partakes in. The IMF is an entity, and we'll learn more about this later, that you go to when you're in financial straits. The World Trade Organization is the referee of trade disputes. They also did not mention the United Nations, which is the peacemaking body of the world to ensure that there is a stable environment. And many of these organizations, in fact, all three of these organizations are under the umbrella of the United Nations. So here you have the International Monetary Fund, gives you more detail as what their functions are. And it says, the last point, lends country foreign exchange to help address balance of payment problems. That's just a way of saying that countries in some cases may be in trouble because they may have more debt than they can bear, and then they have to go for an emergency loans to keep the creditors off their backs. Countries are just like individuals. They have credit ratings, they have credit histories, and if they get in trouble, then they have to go to a debt counselor, like we have to go if we can't pay our bills. And in this case, the IMF serves that function. You have the World Bank again. Initially, it was to provide aid to the rebuilding of Europe, but later on, it became more. It became known more for providing developmental loans for those countries that were in need. And they also have other types of consultation that they provide nations who are trying to develop or trying to make transitions from being agricultural economy to emerging market to industrial economies. There you have these organizations, the World Bank Group. There's the formal name I mentioned. And you don't have to commit all these to memory, but it's important to know that the World Bank is a multifaceted organization. I actually have a friend from graduate school who works for the World Bank. He's an economist. He's from Ghana originally, and I believe he still works there. I haven't talked to him in many years, but certainly it is one of those organizations that has a very controversial history in terms of policies that they have given, or policies that they have provided in terms of advice for nations, and some of them have actually made things worse. They give these long-term loans, low interest, but then they have these conditionalities that are very difficult for some countries to meet. Very controversial history with the World Bank. The WTO was created as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947. It says 48 here, but I think the charter was signed in 1947. In 1995, it became the World Trade Organization after the GATT had outlived its usefulness. And so they added other types of guidelines in there for trade, which included intellectual property. So here you have the WTO and some of the principles in terms of trade, free and fair trade, trade relationships that are stable, promotion of fair competition, and reforms in developing countries. One of the big words here, when you talk about institutions, one of the things that we hear a lot about now is the idea of transparency. You hear a lot about compliance, you hear a lot about ethics. And this has become a very important issue. And not that it was not always an important issue, it's always been an important issue, but it becomes even more of a critical issue because we have an increasingly interdependent global economy. So what happens in one economy can create a cascading effect and bring the entire global economy to a crash or to a halt. We saw that in 2008 when we had the saving and loan crisis, where a lot of these banks they invested in very risky loans with mortgages, giving many potential homeowners these loans that they could not afford. And so once these foreclosures happened after the crisis, then you had many banks that were under fire because of their practices. And then they started to institute a lot of these regulations to ensure that there was transparency in terms of these financial regulations. And even prior to that, you had other regulations like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. You have had others that ensure that there is greater transparency in terms of financial operations. We also hear many of these ideas of good governance, the ensuring that intellectual property is protected, property rights, anti-corruption policies, competitive markets, making sure that markets are fair and that you're not giving an unfair advantage to perhaps those you may have relationships with, whether it be a cousin or whether it be a friend. You want to make sure that you have a free and fair environment because that will spur competition, and with competition, it helps that market grow. And so that is part of this idea of ensuring that you not only have transparency, but you have anti-corruption measures, you have respect for property rights, which are respected by international treaties, and that you have free and fair competition. Of course, the WTO ensures that nations have these policies in place. One other thing that is pretty obvious to you, because you all have only known a world where technology was dominant. I am old enough to remember typewriters. I am old enough to remember when PCs were just taking off. And in fact, I was in the computer industry, and I was in the thick of things. When the computer industry was taking off, I was right there, and I saw companies dropping left and right. And then I saw other companies rising because they were able to figure out how information technology could be leveraged for economic growth. And so this digital generation that they're talking about, these are the digital natives that you often hear, which, and I don't want you all to think because you're digital natives that you know everything about there is to know about technology, because there's a lot more to learn. And because my degree is in computer science, and I did my dissertation in e-business or internet commerce, I understand more of the technical details of technology in terms of how it actually works, and even inside of a computer and how it works and what this circuit does and all of that. So while young adults understand how to use it and the applications, there's a lot more to technology than just the applications. There is how you can deploy technology to create an economic engine. And you learn some of this through digital marketing. If you ever get a chance to take a class in digital marketing, it would help you to understand how this works. Also, the idea of how the technical aspects of web platforms, analytics. Everything is about marketing analytics now. And so these are the things that are becoming very widespread. And when we talk about the use of technology and these tools. Leapfrogging. What is this idea about leapfrogging? Well, when I was doing my dissertation, I did my dissertation on the creating strategies for the use of internet commerce to increase transnational trade in West Africa. So essentially, and dissertation topics are always long, but I'm basically saying you can use e-business as a strategy to increase trade between countries in West Africa. And at that time, and we're talking the late 90s, no one had done research in that area, but I was doing my research in this area. And what had happened was African nations had this urge to wire the continent. Everybody needed a phone line at that time. But then as time went on, we had more emphasis on wireless and satellites. And so the idea to wire all of Africa made no sense. And what happened was many of these African countries, there are 54 African countries now, they leapfrog over the wire era right into the wireless era. And Africa has been one of the fastest growing markets for cell phones for a solid decade because of the fact that that has become the platform in which people communicate on the African continent. This idea of the digital divide, well, obviously technology is a lot more accessible than it was when I was doing my dissertation. And so now everyone has access to similar tools, which means that the advantages that we once had in nations like the United States, in Western Europe, and some other countries that are considered industrialized, those have deteriorated, or they have been neutralized, because now everyone has access to similar tools. And in fact, you go to some of these places and you would be surprised at how these technologies are used in some very inventive and creative ways. The globalization controversy. Now, this book doesn't do a very good job of explaining the pros and cons of globalization. So I'm offering a slide here, and this slide will give you some of the pros and cons. We're actually at 36 minutes, and so we're winding down, but I want to show you this slide because it will give you the pros and cons of globalization. So as you can see here on this slide, arguments for and against globalization. For, better use of global resources, and as I said before, you have a more interdependent globe, and you have the global supply chain, where each country uses the resources to their maximum potential, thus producing better quality, and everyone will focus on what they specialize in, which means that everyone has the best of what the world has to offer. And so you engage in exchange or trades. You trade for what you're not good at producing, and you export what you're good at producing. And so you have an advantage, you have a comparative advantage. You have increased trade activity amongst nations because of free trade that is regulated by the WTO. You have increased output, and thus a bigger pie to divide. Increased rates of technological diffusion. I just mentioned this thing about technology. Once you have technology that is created, that technology is then accessed through exports. When a country gets that technology, a demand is created, and then that country eventually produces it themselves or develops the capacity to produce those products themselves. And you have a wider availability of quality products. Again, because you're taking the best of the best. All the resources are coming together and you're creating quality products. What about against? Why would you be against globalization? Well, there are lots of books that talk about the problems with globalization. There are arguments on both sides. So for against, there is this fear of exploiting developing nations for their raw materials and their cheaper labor. You may have heard of sweatshops. You may have heard about child labor in many countries. And of course, that is considered unethical, but you have had that problem in the past. And because of the fact that you have nations that don't have the type of leverage against these very powerful nations. Some argue that there are increasing inequities between the rich and powerful developed nations and the less prosperous developing nations. And we're talking about countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, parts of Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe. It's considered these developing nations, and also the Middle East. Developed nations, we're talking about Western Europe. You can throw in Australia, North America, which includes Canada, Japan, and now China you have as considered developed nations. Unequal terms of trade. Many developing nations subsist on agricultural exports, which means that if I am exporting cocoa or cotton or coffee or copper, I have to produce a lot of these exports if I want to import industrial goods like tractors or generators or industrial equipment for construction. You trading cocoa for, say, a tractor, you have to produce a lot of cocoa. And not only that, cocoa may fluctuate depending on what type of season you have. So you have these inequities in terms of how trade is conducted between nations. Also, destruction of domestic markets in developing nations because you have rich nations coming in and also destroying smaller local companies. We'll actually see a video on this in India, where there are those protesting against multinational corporations coming in and destroying local businesses. You also have the dominance of multinational corporations over the governments. Sometimes the governments really want these multinational corporations because they think that that's investment, that is more jobs, that is more in terms of the inflows of capital that's going to come into this nation. And so these are some of the arguments, and there are people who are very vocal on both sides of this argument. But I would believe that certainly there are benefits for globalization, but with caution because of some of the arguments that are posed by those who are against. There are still some of these issues that we see, and there's still poverty, there's still inequities, not only between nations, but within nations. You have these different classes, and all of the wealth is not being distributed equally within the nation, not to mention between nations. Making Globalization Work for All. There was actually a book by Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote a book of a similar title, and he was a bit pragmatic about globalization, but he gave some ideas about how it can possibly work. Here they're talking about globalization's winners, and they mention 3 of the BRICS nations, China, India, and Brazil. There are others, and they mention the losers here, Central Asia. We're talking about Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. These are all the stans in Central Asia. Much of Africa, they probably would omit South Africa, some of the Saharan countries like Egypt, maybe Botswana, Namibia would be those countries that they would look at as being potential emerging markets. Nigeria, which is one of the mint countries, and you may have a smaller country like Rwanda, which is doing very well. North Korea, well, when you're sanctioned by the entire globe, then that would probably have a lot to do with your situation. It's a very insular country, and there are other nations who are also on that plane that are very isolated, but you do have reforms in some of these countries. So that is going to do it. We're at 45 minutes. I actually have a video that I'd like to play for you on McDonald's. This is a key video because this video talks about McDonald's going into India. And what's the big deal? Well, McDonald's is going into India in a place where they don't eat beef. And you'll find out why they don't eat beef, but you'll also see how McDonald's manages this market entry strategy. And I think it is very instructive. So on Thursday, we'll actually go over the Cheeseless Cheetos article, and make sure that you're making plans to get the textbook, Introduction to Global Business by Gaspar. There are 5 authors. I just say Gaspar and all, but you have Areola Rizza, Behrman, Heiss, Kalari, and Smith. So you actually have 6 authors on this textbook. So make sure you make the investment. It's an investment in yourself, and you won't regret it. And you want to just make sure that you have all the resources so that you can get the type of grade that that you want. Okay, so I'll see you all on Thursday. Make sure you check for updates, and the video is going to follow. Take care.
The year was 1954. Restaurant supply salesman Ray Kroc first encountered the small California restaurant that embodied his idea for the future, McDonald's. That idea was one of quality food and service for an inexpensive price. What was then just a vision has today turned into one of the single most well-known brand names. And not just in the United States. Today, McDonald's has over 25,000 restaurants, and around half of those are located outside the U.S. In the 1980s, in an effort to continue its growth and avoid oversaturating its American market, McDonald's joined a growing number of companies that were going global. Since that time, McDonald's has become a powerhouse of international expansion. Through a judicious blend of careful research and the desire to bring quality and service to people everywhere, McDonald's has become the most popular restaurant name in the world.
We've opened in 50 countries in the last 5 years as part of a strategy of seizing the global marketplace. During that time frame, we became the best or most well-known global brand. And it is important to our business. It's what creates the huge lines at our restaurants when we open in a particular country. My personal philosophy of McDonald's in terms of the international business is to penetrate the international marketplace the same way we did in the United States and become a part of the local life in each country.
The combination of McDonald's consistently high standards and its ability to adapt its restaurants to local culture has made McDonald's one of the most successful international companies in the world.
I talk about our local approach to doing our business, and our objective is to become a part of the local culture and community. So that the child getting off the plane from any country in the world arriving in the United States talks about, oh, they have McDonald's here too. Future generations will think of McDonald's as their own, and that's our objective.
Perhaps one of the biggest challenges McDonald's has faced in adapting to different cultures came when the company decided to open a restaurant in India.
In terms of the challenges we had in terms of entering India, it really is the only country that we went in knowing that we were not going to serve beef on the menu. And when you're in the hamburger business, that's quite an interesting decision to do that.
Since the cow is a sacred animal in India, McDonald's had to find a way to take that religious and cultural difference into consideration. The company was forced to consider alternatives to its menu options.
So we explored what our other menu options were, which we had several because McDonald's had been selling chicken and fish for many, many years. And the other aspect to the Indian populace is about 40% of them are vegetarians. So that led to expanding our menu there to include vegetable products, such as our veggie burger and our vegetable McNuggets. So that really rounded out our menu to capture and appeal to a very broad segment of the population and not build our business in the face of religious and cultural traditions with regard to beef consumption.
Armed with these options, McDonald's created a menu which included fish, chicken, many vegetable products, and lamb patties instead of beef. The menu, however, was not the only problem McDonald's had when entering India. As a developing country, India's agricultural, communications, and transportation technologies fell short of McDonald's needs. To combat this lack of technology, prior to opening its first store in India, McDonald's sought to develop partnerships with local producers and suppliers. Instead of setting up its own production facilities in a country and staffing it with American workers, McDonald's attempts to introduce the local culture to McDonald's standards and technologies. This effort to work with the local producers to develop a strong base of suppliers helped McDonald's win the support of an originally uncooperative Indian government. This blend of local flavor and powerful business strategy helps McDonald's in many ways. First of all, by building strong ties with local farmers and suppliers, McDonald's is able to quickly gain national support. McDonald's works to increase the quality of local production. In India, they have improved the farmers' harvesting and irrigation technologies. Along with the improvement of quality, McDonald's training of local farmers boosts local economy. Farmers are able to sell their products not only to McDonald's, but also to other consumers, even exporting their products throughout the world. Secondly, the joint ventures allow McDonald's to keep production as local as possible, which lets them bypass any problems that might arise by importing products. McDonald's is able to deal in local currency without the fears of protectionist pressures and tariffs. Furthermore, the company is able to save money on transportation costs.
One of the underpinnings of our financial philosophy of growing our business on a global basis has been our philosophy of trying to be as much a local business as we can. So we generally look for local franchisees, local partners. We staff our companies with local people in terms of advertising, marketing, real estate people, then operations people. And we, to the extent we can, develop an infrastructure of local suppliers within that country.
Along with imparting agricultural training, McDonald's trains its store employees in the keywords of its philosophy: quality, service, cleanliness, and value. This training is the core of McDonald's commitment to quality and gives customers a consistent McDonald's experience anywhere in the world. And it is a continual process.
The training goes on, it's very rigorous, it's very detailed, it's very specific, and everybody understands the culture and what we're trying to do in terms of giving the customer the McDonald's experience. And while you might get a different definition of what that experience is around the world, it won't vary too far from a fun food experience.
While many of McDonald's philosophical underpinnings have remained the same since 1954, technology has provided the company with many opportunities to improve its methods of production and communication. McDonald's has capitalized on new technologies to increase their quality and efficiency.
Some of the specific examples would deal with our communications, in particular satellite communications for our communicating with our restaurants, internet technology in terms of restaurant communications, as well as certainly in our financial systems, managing cash, accounting, record keeping, that type of thing. And then, of course, utilization of hardware and computer. Being able to process transactions for one country in computers that are based in other countries over phone lines and those types of things. All this new technology is really causing us to, and really creating opportunities for us to improve our business and the experience for the customer.
By working with each individual country to create a strong business infrastructure, McDonald's has been able to develop a truly effective global network of producers and suppliers.
We like to develop our suppliers who make the products that are sold to us to fabricate the Big Mac and the French fries. We like it to be local to the extent we can source it locally, but that's not possible. And sometimes it doesn't create the best opportunity from a cost-saving standpoint. So we also have opportunities to leverage or take advantage of the fact that we're in 115 countries operating a business. We have huge volume. Huge amount of meat needs, huge amount of potato needs, huge amount of flour needs, all these products that go into our the Big Mac, and leveraging where we get those from so that we have the lowest costs.
Take, for example, the Big Mac recipe: 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. In Saudi Arabia, the recipe is actually 2 all-beef patties from Spain, special sauce from the U.S., lettuce from Holland, cheese from New Zealand, pickles from the United States, onions from Mexico, along with sesame seeds, which go on top of the bun made from Saudi wheat, Brazilian sugar and oil, and packaging from Germany. Since they can use the most cost-effective supplier from a global network, McDonald's can pass that value to their customers by providing the highest quality product for the lowest possible cost. Since 1954, McDonald's has grown from one man's vision and a solid commitment to service and quality into one of the most well-known brand names in the world. The company has restaurants in 115 countries, and together these countries make up over 95% of the world's purchasing power. Through a strong global network of suppliers, producers, management, and restaurants, McDonald's has worked to improve the quality of food and service throughout the world. The sun never sets on McDonald's food service empire, and there is no end in sight.
I'm always asked the question about how you decide to be a global company initially. And I think that's a pretty simple answer in terms of our business. And that's we feed people. And most of the people on the earth live outside the United States. So it isn't a really difficult conclusion to reach that in terms of potential feeding people. That opportunity lies mostly outside the United States. Today, just with our 25,000 restaurants, there are, I think it's 18 billion meal opportunities a day. That's each person on the earth eating 3 meals a day. We only provide 40 million of those. So that's less than 1/2 of 1%. So we have a huge opportunity to build our business.